I've never been the favorite, but I've always been the one who showed up. Birthdays, family emergencies, even the small things, I was there. I didn't need applause for it. I just believed, maybe naively, that consistency would eventually mean something, that quiet loyalty could outshine noisy charm. I kept showing up. I thought that mattered. Then came the text from my mother. Family meeting. Tonight. Be home. No explanation. No tone. Just cold words on a screen. I even brought dessert, like an idiot, thinking maybe someone was sick or there was a trip to plan. But the moment I stepped into that living room, I felt the shift. My dad wouldn't even look at me. My mom's lips were tight. And my brother? He was already sitting down, looking like he knew the punchline to a joke I hadn't heard yet. "We know what you did," my mother said. Just like that. No build-up. My dad dropped a flimsy folder onto the coffee table like it was a bomb. I opened it, trying to process what I was looking at, some low-resolution bank screenshots and notes scribbled in red pen. "You think I stole from you?" I asked, barely able to form the words. My pulse was pounding so loud I could hardly hear their reply. Dad shouted something about betrayal. Mom started crying, the kind of tears meant for show, not pain. "You had access," she hissed. "And now there's money missing." I turned to my brother, my last hope for sanity in the room. But he just leaned back, arms crossed, watching me fall apart. No words, no defense, just silence, and that smug little smirk that would burn into my memory for good. I kept waiting for the moment they'd stop, for someone to say, "Wait, let's actually talk about this." But it never came. Every question I asked was met with cold certainty. My father acted like judge and executioner, waving those fake proofs around like they meant anything. My mother clung to this story like it explained every disappointment they'd ever had in me. And my brother, he just let them. He let them destroy me. It wasn't just shock, it was betrayal with a sharp edge. I'd trusted them with every part of me, my time, my energy, my loyalty. I'd cleaned up after their fights, driven my brother home when he was too drunk to stand, covered for him when he blew through money he didn't have. And now, here they were, acting like I was a criminal, like I was some stranger who had snuck in and robbed them blind. I felt small in that room, invisible, but also under a spotlight. I tried defending myself. I really did. I asked them to look deeper, to think about who actually had the motive, the access, the history. But it didn't matter. They'd already made up their minds. "We raised you better than this," my dad said, like it was a line rehearsed in a mirror. My mom just kept shaking her head, whispering, "I don't even know who you are anymore." And that's when I realized they weren't looking for the truth. They were looking for someone to blame. When I walked out of that house, something in me cracked. Not loudly, just a quiet, precise fracture I could feel in my chest. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just kept replaying the scene in my head. The folder, the silence, my brother's smirk. The worst part? A tiny part of me still hoped they'd call me back, say they'd made a mistake. But the phone never rang. That silence told me everything I needed to know. The days that followed were a blur of shame and disbelief. I couldn't eat. I couldn't sleep. Every time my phone buzzed, my heart jumped. Not out of fear, but that desperate, foolish hope that someone would say, "We got it wrong." But all I got were cold shoulders and silence. Even extended relatives pulled away, clearly briefed by my parents on the scandal. I became a whisper at family gatherings, a warning tale, a stain on their picture-perfect home. What hurt most wasn't the accusation. It was how easy it was for them to believe it. All those years I'd tried to be enough, to earn their approval in quiet, consistent ways. None of it mattered. The second something went wrong, they turned on me like I'd always been disposable, like I'd been waiting for a moment to betray them. I kept thinking, if this is how they see me, then who have I been trying so hard to love? I avoided the house, ignored their calls when they came, which was rare. The only consistent contact came from my brother, or rather, the lack of it. He didn't reach out once, no texts, no questions, just radio silence. And yet I couldn't shake the image of his smug face at that table. The more I sat with it, the more the pieces began to shift. Not just emotionally, logically. His calmness, their desperation to blame me, the proof that didn't hold up under scrutiny. It all started to stink. That's when the anger settled in. Quiet, patient anger. The kind that doesn't scream or shatter plates. It just waits. Waits for answers. Waits for clarity. And somewhere deep inside, I promised myself something. If I was going to be their villain, I'd start acting like one. But not the reckless kind. No, I'd be the kind that waits, watches, and learns exactly how the game is played. Being cast out felt like mourning a version of myself I didn't even realize had died. I wasn't just losing my place in the family. I was losing the illusion that I ever really had one. They kept me on the outside, but close enough to remind me what I'd lost. At gatherings, they spoke in half sentences when I entered the room. They didn't say it outright, but I could feel it in the way they glanced at each other. I was the disgrace, the disappointment, the girl who'd done something unforgivable. And yet, my brother? He was thriving, at least on the surface. New sneakers that cost more than my rent, designer watches, weekend getaways, dinner photos with champagne flutes raised high. No job to speak of, no visible income, but somehow always flush with cash. My parents didn't question it. They bragged about his networking and his business ideas like he was some kind of young mogul. Meanwhile, I was told to make things right, to repay what I took, to prove I still had character. I wanted to believe there was a logical explanation, that maybe he had a side hustle or some generous investor. But deep down, I already knew. I just didn't want to say it out loud. Not yet. Then one night, a mutual friend messaged me, completely out of the blue. She wasn't even trying to start drama. She just said, "Hey, I'm a little worried about your brother. He's been borrowing money from everyone, even people he barely knows." And suddenly, the pretty little facade cracked open. That night, I went digging. I wasn't even sure what I was looking for, but something inside me pushed forward. Late into the night, I scrolled through old emails, texts, anything I could find. And piece by piece, it started coming together. Bank transfers that lined up with the dates of his trips, debt collection notices in his name, messages asking friends to cover for him. And in the middle of it all, my parents' account, bled dry, quietly and consistently. Not by me, by him. I stared at the numbers until they blurred. The pattern was so obvious once I saw it. Transfers labeled as loan repayments, sudden withdrawals right before his lavish trips, notes in his own handwriting that matched the ones my parents used against me. It wasn't just negligence. It was calculated. He was playing them. And the worst part? They were letting him. No questions asked, no suspicions raised, just blind, reckless loyalty wrapped in parental pride. The betrayal stung differently now. It wasn't just that they'd chosen to believe I was guilty. It was that they needed me to be. If I was the thief, then they didn't have to confront the truth about him. Their precious boy could stay untarnished, and they could stay the proud parents of a successful son instead of the enablers of a liar who was bleeding them dry. I wasn't a person to them in that moment. I was a shield, a scapegoat, a story they could sell to everyone else. I started collecting everything, screenshots, statements, even voice memos from people he owed money to. I didn't have a plan yet, not exactly, but I knew this. I wouldn't be the fool they dragged through the mud while he waltzed through life untouched. They wanted me quiet. They wanted me small. But all that silence had done was give me time to listen. And the more I listened, the more I heard. Cracks in conversations, inconsistencies, little tells they hadn't bothered to hide. I watched from the outside as my parents praised him over dinner, laughed at his jokes, called him such a good boy. And I just smiled. I smiled and nodded and swallowed every bitter truth like it was honey. Because now, I wasn't just the accused. I was the witness, the one person who saw everything clearly, and I was done begging to be believed. I was done cleaning up his messes. This time, I'd make sure he had to answer for every single one. What cut the deepest wasn't his debt or his lies. It was how effortlessly he let me take the fall. No hesitation, no guilt. He didn't just stay silent, He watched me burn. And when I think about that night, his arms crossed, that smug, hollow grin, I wonder if this was always in him. Maybe the signs were there all along. The manipulation masked as charm. The way he never had to face consequences, just shifted blame like it was second nature. I started replaying our childhood in my head. He broke the vase. I was blamed. He missed curfew. I covered. He flunked his classes. I tutored him through. Over and over the same pattern. His mess, my cleanup. And back then, I thought I was being a good sister. I thought I was protecting someone who just needed a little extra help. But now I see it for what it was. Grooming. Not the obvious kind. The kind that teaches you your pain is worth less than someone else's comfort. And my parents, they weren't innocent either. Maybe they didn't know the whole picture, but they chose not to see it. It was easier to crown him the golden child than to admit they'd raised a son who lies, steals, and smiles while doing it. They needed someone to be the cautionary tale, someone to blame when the story got ugly. And I was always the safe choice. Quiet, composed, forgiving, easy to paint as bitter if I ever pushed back. But things were different now. I had the truth, and more importantly, I had proof. And with every screenshot I saved, every whispered confession I recorded, something hardened inside me. The need to be loved was fading. What replaced it wasn't rage. It was precision. If they wanted to live inside a lie, I was going to give them a truth so sharp it cut through every word they'd ever used against me. I didn't storm into the house with the receipts. I didn't scream or throw their lies in their faces. That would have been too easy, too loud. And honestly, it would have let them off the hook. No. I gave them what they wanted, or at least what they thought they wanted. I became the disappointed daughter, the one who bowed her head in shame and quietly faded out of the family photos. It wasn't surrender. It was staging. I played my role perfectly. I sent polite texts that went unanswered. I smiled when they called me troubled behind my back. At Sunday dinners, I offered to help in the kitchen, only to be waved off like a nuisance. And all the while, I was watching, listening, documenting, every cold glance, every dismissive tone, every moment that proved just how easily they had written me off. I kept notes, not for revenge, not yet, but for truth, for clarity. For the day I'd need to remember why I stopped protecting them. While they stayed wrapped in their illusion, I started building a life that belonged to me. I found a new apartment, a job that paid well and respected me. I began going to therapy, not because I was broken, but because I needed to understand how I'd spent so many years trying to earn love that should have never come with conditions. For the first time, I looked at myself and didn't see a problem to fix. I saw a person worth saving, even if no one else ever had. And as I built, I also prepared. I didn't want revenge that exploded. I wanted one that unraveled. One that made them question their memories, their choices, their devotion to someone who never earned it. So I kept gathering evidence, lining it up like dominoes, one after another. Quiet, patient, intentional. Because if they wanted a villain so badly, then I'd give them one. But not the kind that steals, the kind that reveals. There was something strangely liberating about being the outsider. I didn't have to perform anymore. No more fake smiles. No more pretending I didn't notice the condescension in their voices. I stopped trying to earn back a seat at their table and started designing my own. Every paycheck I saved, every document I filed, every hour spent researching financial laws and family trusts, it wasn't just preparation, it was healing. Strategic, focused healing. I started meeting with a lawyer, just quiet consultations at first. I needed to know what my rights were, what protections I had, and how deep my brother's damage could go. Turns out it was worse than I imagined. He'd not only drained accounts, he'd falsified signatures, misrepresented assets, and pulled my parents into financial agreements they barely understood. And still, they called me the liability. It would have been laughable if it hadn't hurt so much. But I didn't let that hurt stop me. I let it sharpen me. I became fluent in the language of strategy, Legal clauses, timelines, burden of proof. I documented every conversation, every text, every smirk he offered in passing. I started recording phone calls, saving voicemails, even noting changes in their tone toward me. Not because I needed revenge to feel good, but because I needed it to be undeniable. I wasn't building a trap. I was building a mirror. And slowly, I stopped feeling small. I'd walk past them at gatherings, holding my head just a little higher. Not to provoke, but to remind myself I didn't belong beneath anyone. I wasn't the mess they made me out to be. I was the proof they never expected to surface. And every time my brother laughed a little too loudly, I felt calmer. Because I knew something he didn't, that his comfort was borrowed. And soon, the bill would come due. I used to think closure came from apologies. From people realizing the damage they caused and trying to make it right. But I've learned that sometimes closure is accepting that the apology will never come, and deciding to move forward anyway. My family had made their choice. They handed me the role of the disgrace, then applauded my brother like he'd never done a single thing wrong. Fine, let them clap. I was writing a different ending. Each day I added another layer to my case. I wasn't just proving my innocence. I was creating a timeline, a narrative, something airtight, something that couldn't be dismissed as bitterness or revenge. I wanted the facts to speak louder than my pain, and that meant every detail mattered. The dates, the amounts, the people he conned. I didn't have their loyalty, but I had the truth, and in time, that would be louder than any lie they'd ever told. The hardest part was keeping my face neutral. Smiling through dinners, nodding when my parents talked about how hard things had been for them. Sometimes I had to bite the inside of my cheek just to stay silent. But I did. I swallowed my pride, bit by bit, until it wasn't pride anymore. It was resolve. They had no idea what I was building behind that smile. No clue what was coming. And that was the most satisfying part. They thought they'd broken me, that I'd quietly disappear under the weight of their accusations. What they didn't know is that I was never disappearing. I was becoming. And soon, everything they thought they understood about me, about him, would collapse. Not in a fight, not in chaos, but in precision. I wouldn't scream. I'd simply hand them the truth and let it detonate from the inside. My father's birthday was the perfect stage, not too big, not too small, just intimate enough that the people who mattered would be there, the ones they cared about impressing. Aunts, uncles, close family friends, the kind of crowd that feeds off appearances and polite lies. I dressed nicely. I smiled. I even brought a bottle of wine. I gave no warning, no indication that tonight would be anything other than a celebration, because it was, just not the kind they expected. When it was time for gifts, I stood up and handed my father a sealed envelope. "Something personal," I said, keeping my voice light. He opened it slowly, like he thought it was a handwritten letter or a family photo. But the second he started reading, I saw it. The shift in his eyes, confusion, then disbelief, then that cold wash of recognition. My mother leaned over his shoulder, scanning the documents, pages and pages, printouts, records, transaction logs, a full dossier. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. "I've sent copies to the family lawyer, to Aunt Lila, and to Mr. Donnelly from the bank," I said, loud enough for the room to hear. "In case this one gets misplaced." You could have heard a fork drop. My mother's face went pale. My father's hand trembled. My brother stood frozen, somewhere between panic and rage. That was the moment. The quiet implosion. No screaming match, just the truth, unfolding in front of every pair of watching eyes. And then, the cherry on top. I pulled out my phone and played the audio. A recording of my brother, laughing with a friend, bragging about how easy it was to pin it on Elena. His exact words, his voice, crystal clear. I didn't look at him while it played. I watched them, my parents, as the weight of it landed. The room didn't erupt, it sank. A heavy silence thick enough to choke on. They framed me as the disgrace. Now I'd hung their golden boy on a wall of shame. Nobody knew what to say at first. The kind of silence that makes you feel like you've stepped outside of time. My brother opened his mouth like he was going to speak, then stopped. maybe realizing nothing he could say would undo what everyone had just heard. My mother reached for my father's hand, but he pulled away, still flipping through the pages like if he read them fast enough, they'd stop being true. The image they'd built for years was crumbling. And I didn't feel joy. I felt release. Aunt Lila was the first to break the silence. She looked straight at me and said, "You knew all this, and you waited." It wasn't a question, it was awe. I nodded once, steady. They needed the truth. I just chose the right moment to show it. I caught the eyes of people who had whispered about me, judged me, dismissed me. Now they didn't know where to look, and I didn't flinch. I wanted them to see me, not the version they were told to believe in, but me. My brother finally found his voice, and of course, it came out angry. "So what, you've been spying on me? Digging through my life?" I met his glare without blinking. "No. I've been cleaning up after your messes my entire life. This time, I kept the receipts." He didn't respond, just clenched his jaw and looked around for someone, anyone, to back him up. But no one moved, not even the cousins who used to laugh at his jokes and follow him around like shadows. My parents didn't defend him. Not this time. They sat there, stunned, drowning in the weight of what they'd refused to see. And in that moment, I realized something simple but powerful. The truth doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers so precisely, it cuts deeper than any scream ever could. And while they were still trying to process the damage, I had already moved on, emotionally, mentally. I wasn't asking for anything. I was just finally handing back what never belonged to me. I didn't wait for their apology, and because I knew it wouldn't come. Not in that moment, maybe not ever. My parents were too stunned, too shaken by the reflection I had held up to them. They looked older somehow, as if the truth had aged them in an instant. My brother? He didn't even try to deny it anymore. He just sat there, simmering. And I realized, for the first time in my life, he had no control over the room. That power he always wore like a crown was gone. I left before dessert. I didn't need to stay and watch the unraveling. That wasn't my role anymore. I had delivered what needed to be delivered. The story had changed, and I didn't need to narrate the aftermath. Let them sit in it. Let them feel what I had felt for months. Confusion, disbelief, isolation. Let them taste the bitter silence they had fed me spoonful by spoonful. I walked out without looking back. Not in anger, but in peace. On the drive home, I didn't cry. I didn't shake. I didn't replay the night like I used to after every family gathering. I turned on my favorite music, rolled the window down, let the cool air hit my face. Something in me had shifted completely. I wasn't waiting to be understood anymore. I wasn't carrying the weight of proving my worth to people who had chosen not to see it. I wasn't the scapegoat. Not anymore. And while they sat around the ruins of their perfect narrative, I was already building something better, something that belonged entirely to me. The chapter they wrote about me had ended. I was holding the pen now, and I knew exactly where the next one would begin. The fallout came quickly, like a storm they never saw coming. Calls I didn't answer, messages filled with half apologies, all laced with guilt but no real ownership. My parents wanted to talk, to clear the air. But I wasn't interested in repair. I'd lived too long in their silence, swallowed too much of their doubt, for words to mean anything now. Forgiveness isn't a switch you flip. Sometimes it's a door you close, gently, firmly, for good. My brother's world unraveled faster than I expected. The people who once praised him began backing away. Debt collectors came knocking, and with the exposure, even his flimsy job prospects vanished. He tried to cast blame outward, as always, but there was no one left to shield him. Not me, not our parents, not even the friends who once admired his confidence. He was alone. Finally. Not because I took anything, but because I stopped giving. And still, I didn't gloat. That's what surprised me the most. I thought I'd feel victorious. Instead, I just felt free. I'd carried their shame like it was mine, their dysfunction, their favoritism, their denial. I'd worn it like a coat I never asked for, and now I'd taken it off, let it fall, and walked away lighter. For the first time, I looked in the mirror and saw someone I respected, not because she was perfect, but because she never gave up on herself. Then came the letter, a thick envelope delivered by hand. Inside, the last thing I expected, a will. A distant relative I barely knew had been following everything. She'd seen what happened, and in her final act, she rewrote her estate. Left everything, property, stocks, a lakeside home, to me. She said I reminded her of herself, a woman who was overlooked until she wasn't, a woman who survived. And I realized then, I hadn't just reclaimed my name. I'd inherited something far greater. I visited the house a week later, the one she left me. It sat by the water, surrounded by trees that whispered when the wind moved through them. It wasn't extravagant, but it was peaceful. Solid. Mine. I walked through each room slowly, tracing the woodwork with my fingers, breathing in the stillness. No one else had a key. No one else could take this from me. It was the first place I'd ever stepped into, and felt completely untouchable. I found her photo on the mantel, the relative who saw me when my own parents refused to. We'd only spoken a handful of times, but somehow she had understood what I was carrying. Her letter said, "Strength isn't loud, Elena. Sometimes it's just choosing not to disappear." I sat with that for a long time, because I had come so close to disappearing, into their story, into their shame. But I didn't. I chose to be seen. And now someone had written my name in ink where it could never be erased. Word spread fast, of course. My parents heard about the inheritance. There were murmurs of confusion, of disbelief. Then came the anger. They couldn't understand why she'd chosen me. Why not them? Why not the good son? But that was the point, wasn't it? This wasn't about bloodlines or performance. It was about legacy. And she knew, even from afar, who had carried the weight with grace, who had told the truth when it hurt, who had risen without stepping on anyone to do it. I didn't return their calls. I didn't owe them explanations. For the first time in my life, I wasn't trying to fix what they'd broken. I was living, on my terms, in a space I hadn't begged for, but earned. And every quiet morning in that house, every cup of coffee on the porch overlooking the lake, reminded me, I was never the disgrace. I was just the only one brave enough to face the truth and survive it. There are moments now, quiet, fleeting ones, where the past taps gently on my shoulder. A scent that reminds me of my mother's perfume. A headline about fraud that makes me think of my brother. I don't push them away. I let them come. I let them pass. They don't sting like they used to. They don't have power anymore. They're just echoes of a life I outgrew. A life that tried to shrink me until I chose to grow beyond its borders. Some days I still wonder what my life might have been if they had believed me, if they'd stood by me instead of turning their backs. But then I remember, if they hadn't cast me out, I wouldn't have found this strength. I wouldn't have rebuilt from the ground up. I wouldn't have discovered that survival isn't just about enduring. It's about redefining who you are when no one's clapping. When the spotlight is gone. When you choose yourself, quietly and without apology. The town talks, of course. They always do. Some still say I was cold, ruthless, calculated. Maybe I was. Or maybe I just got tired of shrinking to fit the story they needed me to play. I don't correct them. Let them wonder. Let them rewrite the tale a dozen different ways. I know the truth. And it's etched into the foundation of this house, into the contracts with my name on them, into every step I take without looking over my shoulder. Now I walk through these halls, mine, in peace. No whispers, no shame. Just sunlight, quiet, and freedom. They gave everything to their favorite, and in the end, he gave them nothing but disgrace. But me, the scapegoat? I walked away with everything that mattered. Not just the house, not just the inheritance. But the unshakable truth, I was never the problem. I was the proof.